Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. We are going to give folks a few minutes to trickle in and join, so we'll begin in just a couple of minutes. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. It is Tuesday, May 14th, and we would like to welcome you to the webinar that's officially launching the new SDG Accountability Handbook convened by the TAP Network. I am Coco Lammers. I'm the Senior Policy and Campaigns Officer at NUMITY, but I'm also the co-chair of the TAP Network Steering Committee, and it is my pleasure to be here with you all today to help moderate today's session. But before we get started, I first want to thank the Global Legal Empowerment Network for hosting this webinar for us today. If you haven't already and would like to join the network for free, you can actually join at numity.org. And I just want to go over a few brief housekeeping items before we get started today. So please note that this event is being recorded, and we will share the full recording and highlights later on the website and with all of you after the webinar is concluded. And I also want to make sure that you can hear well and are able to use our webinar system properly. So you'll see a questions panel on the right side where you can type in some of your comments and communicate with us. And there's also a button for raising your hand to get our attention. And feel free to test it out if you'd like to try it now. And then the other piece of it is that, please feel free to type in your comments, any ideas, suggestions, best practices in the questions panel as we move along. We want to make sure we can hear from you. We will also have questions for discussion in the second half of the webinar, where we'll actually open up the floor for comments from the floor. But and while we do that, please bear in mind, as my colleagues respond to your various requests and some of the comments, I have colleagues Michael and Madeline from the Global Legal Empowerment Network standing by to field your questions and to help take notes for the sessions today. So that I will leave it at that for today's housekeeping portion of the session. But now it is my sincere pleasure to turn over to what we're all here for today, which is the official launch of the SDG Accountability Handbook that the TAP Network has put together. On behalf of the TAP Network Steering Committee, I want to begin by congratulating all of you, the TAP Network Secretariat, the SDG Accountability Advisory Group, and the TAP membership for the dedication to this project, to really ensuring its completion from design to launch, which we're celebrating here today. As many of you know, in 2015, 193 member states at the United Nations adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, or also known as the 2030 Agenda, which really is the global 15-year plan of action to end poverty, promote the planet, and ensure prosperity for all, while really focusing on strengthening universal peace and larger freedoms. And similar to its predecessor, the Millennium Development Goals, it had accompanying goals, but, with the 2030 Agenda, these goals were actually much more in-depth and robust, and the process was a lot more consultative, especially with civil society. And so the accompanying Sustainable Development Goals, also known as SDGs, are really a political declaration that's not legally binding. It really means that countries face no defined consequences if they fail to meet some of these serious efforts on the goals and targets. As such, it is really important that people, and in particular civil society, actively engage and participate in these processes and where they exist to hold their governments accountable for the SDG commitments. This is why we're so pleased to be here today to launch a brand new resource for this community, this SDG Accountability Handbook. Today, we're joined by a distinguished group of panelists. We have John Romano from the TAP Network, we have Ollie Henman from Action for Sustainable Development, Arlis Bellerini from World Vision, and Claire Schouten from the International Budget Partnership. And they're each going to discuss this new resource and how to use it in their and our context kind of more broadly. I'm first going to turn it over to John Romano from the TAP Network to provide an overview of the SDG Accountability Handbook, including an explanation of why and how the resource was developed, as well as an explanation of its structure and the ways it can be used by national and local level civil society. We'll then turn it over to Ollie, then Arlis and Claire, some of the experts who were part of the advisory committee for this project, all of whom have worked extensively around issues of social accountability and the 2030 Agenda to examine the role of civil society in helping to deliver and ensure government accountability for the SDGs. I'm going to ask each of them to briefly answer a few questions during their presentations. But before I do that, I'm going to turn it over to John Romano from the TAP Network. John, I hope you'll be able to join us. Congratulations on the launch of the SDG Accountability Handbook. I'm curious to hear from you about the start of this project, how it really evolved from conception to implementation, and why is this resource an important priority for the TAP Network. John, over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Coco, and thanks to all of you for joining this webinar. I'm really excited to actually be able to launch this with all of you. For many of you, you know that this has been a long work in progress, better part of the past year or so. It was a really consultative process, I think, for the benefit of the quality of the handbook and where it stands currently. So I'll, as Coco mentioned, I'll take you through how we got here, what is the SDG Accountability Handbook, how can it be used by colleagues, particularly at the national level, and where do we go from here? A bit of reflections on how we want to take this forward and how we hope to partner with many of you going forward around this handbook. So I thought maybe we would just start by a brief introduction to the TAP network for those of you that do not know about TAP's work. We're a global network of over 400 civil society organizations based in over 75 countries. Those 400 organizations also include around 70 or more partners. We call them partners, and these are colleagues and organizations that have actually made concrete commitments towards advancing SDG 16 and accountability for the 2030 Agenda in their own context. And so, what we do is, over the past few years since the adoption of the 2030 Agenda, we've worked extensively with our partners, particularly at the regional and national level, to help strengthen the capacity of civil society to not just take forward SDG 16, but also how to hold governments accountable to all of the SDG commitments. And so those of you that may know us before may know us through our Goal 16 Advocacy Toolkit, which we launched in 2016, just after the adoption of the 2030 agenda. We also have a supplementary resource called Advocacy, Justice, and the SDGs. It's an advocacy toolkit specifically around issues of access to justice within the context of Goal 16. We also launched the SDG 16 Data Initiative to help track progress on SDG 16 with a number of other partners from the SDG 16 realm. It's really simple to find. It's just sdg16.org. And obviously for those of you that would like to join, there's a link here in the presentation. It's really simple, tapnetwork2030.org/join. And so we're always looking for additional partners, and I'll get to it a little bit more on how we plan on working with our members and other civil society partners going forward. And we really look forward to working with some of our national and regional partners to help take this SDG Accountability Handbook forward. Just a quick note to also say that this SDG Accountability Handbook also included a group of an advisory group for the drafting of this handbook. So over the course of the past year or so, these colleagues, all of them are experts on social accountability and the 2030 agenda, have engaged extensively around these issues to date. You can see all of those colleagues listed in the presentation there. But I just want to say a quick word of thanks to all of those colleagues from the advisory group. You know, it was a long and comprehensive process to get to this point, and they've contributed a huge amount of content and a lot of guidance throughout this entire process. So again, a word of thanks to the advisory group throughout this entire process. So I'll get into the SDG Accountability Handbook now. You know, one of the things that we were able to also secure for this was a special message from Amina Mohammed, who is the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. For those of you that have been engaged with the SDGs to date, know that Ms. Mohammed has been a very avid advocate for civic space and civil society space. She was instrumental in the 2030 agenda negotiation process, including the lead up to the negotiations. And so we're really glad and we're very happy to have her support for this. And I think you know, it's great to see, you know, a really strong advocate and you know, especially someone from working in the high level of the UN to actually support these types of efforts. And so we look forward to not just working with colleagues from civil society, but to working with colleagues from the UN and also governments as well in taking this forward. So just going, you know, talking a little bit about the handbook. You know, this is a resource guide particularly for national level civil society, to help them understand different approaches to accountability, to holding governments accountable to the SDGs and other 2030 agenda commitments. And so, you know, for us, it's a capacity building tool. We wanted it to be practical. We wanted it to really focus on guidance on how colleagues can actually use these approaches. And so I'll talk a little bit about those different approaches in just a second. But you know, that's really our purpose. And again, it's intended for colleagues, particularly at the national or local level, and particularly for those colleagues that haven't necessarily worked with the 2030 agenda to date. I mean, this is, I think, an opportunity to not just engage the colleagues and the organizations that have engaged with the SDGs so far, but it's to bring in other colleagues to say, you know, if you are working on issues of gender equality, for example, in your own national, local context, how can you use the SDGs as an opportunity to push ambition and to hold your government accountable for additional commitments that they've made towards those issues that you work on? And again, so it focuses on the issue of holding governments and duty bearers accountable for their commitments to the SDGs, and again, provide some practical resources and guidance to help you do that. The handbook features 17 total approaches to accountability. This is it's a happy coincidence that there are 17 SDGs and there are 17 approaches to accountability. This wasn't intentional, but again, a happy coincidence. It covers a wide range of approaches to holding your government accountable to the SDGs, ranging from working with government institutions and parliamentarians and local authorities, to engaging in the VNR process, which I know for many colleagues, it's a great way to engage around the SDGs, but in some cases, governments may not be as open in their VNR process. And so we wanted to give some guidance on those particular issues and how to engage in the formal processes with governments around the SDGs. There's a separate category on working on oversight for accountability. I think largely with the role that civil society should play in the role of accountability for the 2030 agenda. There's some guidance on different stakeholders, so different institutions that you can work with at the national level in the case that they exist in your country that you can use to help hold your government accountable. There's some guidance on some informal processes. So that's to say, how separate from the official engagement channels through the government or through other institutions, how can you, within civil society, how can you formalize and kind of mobilize yourselves in your particular context to hold governments accountable? And I think the marquee chapter there for us that we spent quite a bit of time on and got a lot of guidance from our partners at the national level is around publishing civil society spotlight reports. And so you may call them shadow reports or parallel reports, what we refer to as spotlight reports for the handbook purposes. And so this is how to basically mobilize around with civil society and hold governments accountable through other processes. And then, of course, there's other approaches to accountability. Recognizing that there are many approaches to social accountability. We obviously had a lot of options to choose from. These were kind of these four sections, and those approaches to accountability in those four sections fit very neatly into those categories. But of course, there's other opportunities, including through engaging in the high-level political forum on sustainable development. For example, there's quite a bit of guidance on how you can engage with the HLPF every year. And then there's a bit of information there about how do we hold other stakeholders accountable, not just government. So how do we hold ourselves as civil society accountable, and how do we hold the private sector accountable? And so there's a little bit of information there and some guidance on those fronts as well. Each of these approaches to accountability, I won't go into too much depth because, again, if you do want to explore this further, the content is there in the SDG Accountability Handbook. It's very thorough. But I'll go over just, what each of these approaches to accountability includes. So again, it brings together practical guidance. What we wanted to do is to make sure that this information was easy to understand, that it's easy for colleagues to understand how they can use it and why it's important, and also, interspersed throughout each of the chapters. We also include some key tips to consider as well. So, for example, there's tips to guide colleagues to say, when you're thinking about putting together a civil society spotlight report, for example, you should also consider this. You should consider working with other CSOs in your countries. So it's a bit of some really concrete tips to consider when you're actually taking forward this accountability work in your context. Also recognizing that this is just one of many social accountability resources out there. We also wanted to be sure that we were including links to other key resources. So in the case that the SDG Accountability Handbook doesn't necessarily, or you want to find out more information about some of these approaches to accountability, we've linked out to other key resources that you can find to find out more. Obviously there's a lot of resources out there and we want to be inclusive of the colleagues that have those resources as well. So we thought that was important to include there in each of those chapters, which I think will be helpful to everyone. And finally, we have case studies. These case studies, I think, are also really important for helping colleagues understand how it's been used before. I mean, it's one thing to talk about the practical guidance on how you can do it, but I think seeing examples of where colleagues had actually done it before, where they've done it successfully, maybe where they haven't been successful, and some of the lessons that they've learned, I think is really important as well. And just also a quick word of thanks to the TAP network members that submitted case studies for this. We had many case studies that actually wouldn't fit in the print version. What we want to do going forward, and I'll talk about this in just a second, is be more inclusive of all the case studies that colleagues bring to the table. And so we'll have a platform where we'll accept additional case studies and then showcase them on the digital version of the SDG Accountability Handbook. These are just some of the opportunities to engage going forward. I mentioned the case studies. What we want to do is collect these case studies and showcase them to say, to showcase the work that civil society colleagues at the national level are doing to undertake accountability at the national and local levels. I think this is important. So this is one way that you can engage with us. You can submit these case studies. The other is that you can submit civil society spotlight reports, and grateful that Ali Henman from Action for Sustainable Development is here as well, as I know they've done a lot of work on this as well, and we're actually working with A4SD on some of these things. I think sharing of spotlight reports, in the absence of an official channel to submit civil society spotlight reports to the HLPF each year, I think it's important to provide a platform for colleagues to actually share and showcase the reports that they've put together. So that's another way that you can engage with us on this. We're also looking for partners on events and workshops. I'll mention this in just a second, but about some of the things that we're doing. But we want this to be a practical resource, and we want colleagues to actually go out and use it. We want colleagues to use this as an opportunity to mobilize civil society in your own country. So you can reach out to us and inquire about partnering on a workshop in your own context. And then there's an opportunity to provide new content for the handbook, recognizing obviously that these are many approaches to holding governments accountable to the SDGs, but it's not necessarily, there may be other approaches. You can also provide that content that we can also showcase going forward as well. So we're looking for new content partners going forward to showcase new approaches to accountability as well. I'll talk very briefly about what comes next. I mentioned the national workshops. So right now, along with our partners Action for Sustainable Development and the Civil Society Platform for Peace Building and State Building, we'll be hosting workshops in up to 13 countries in 2019 before the HLPF, utilizing this SDG Accountability Handbook. I think this is a good opportunity. All of these countries that we're hosting workshops in are their governments are presenting voluntary national reviews at the 2019 HLPF. And so I think this is a good opportunity for us to kind of test the SDG Accountability Handbook and allow colleagues to actually work with it, utilize these resources to how they can hold their government accountable and engage in the VNR process in each of their countries. We're also looking to then translate the SDG Accountability Handbook going forward, similar to what we did with the Goal 16 Advocacy Toolkit. It's available in the six official UN languages. We're looking for partners to actually take these translations forward. I know that those 6 official languages is a good start, but there are many more that we wouldn't reach with those languages. And so we're looking for colleagues to, if you feel like this would be useful in your own context and you need it in another language, please do reach out, because we do want to make this as inclusive and accessible as possible. And again, we're looking to launch the Accountability Handbook at different opportunities, host additional webinars, possibly in other languages as well. And so we're looking for partners on that. I think the one thing also that I didn't mention thus far is that there's the print version of the SDG Accountability Handbook. I think that's a good resource. But one of the things that we really wanted to do was provide an online web version of the SDG Accountability Handbook. I mean, I think it's one thing to read from top to bottom. It's 100 pages of print material of all of these approaches to accountability. But I think having a web version is also I think it's important for us. It makes the content a bit more accessible, and also for those of you that have web browsers that have translation functions built into them, all of that content is able to be translated through Google Translate or other programs through your own internet browser to translate into local languages that you would use as well. So that helps to make it a little bit more accessible, we hope, going forward. And I hope that this is a platform that you all will look to engage with us going forward. And so I'll stop there. It's a lot of content to digest, and I look forward to hearing some the input from our other colleagues. But just a quick note to say that you can contact us, you can email us. The links are on the website. You can tweet at us with hashtag SDG accountability. And of course, as I mentioned at the top of the presentation, you can join the TAP network. We're always looking for strong partners, particularly at the national and local level, to really help us take this SDG accountability handbook and make it real for partners amongst civil society at the national level. And so, of course, all of this information is available on our website. It's very easy to find. It's just www.sdgaccountability.org. So I look forward to any questions that you have, and really look forward to working with many of you going forward to take this handbook forward in your own context. So thank you.
Thank you so much, John. It is so exciting to see this piece of work come together, and you can tell how much work and thoughtfulness has gone into creating this resource for civil society to be able to help hold their governments accountable. And really exciting to see, that the versions have been made kind of accessible on different, this website, and there's print versions as well. And then also really exciting to hear about plans for translations in other languages, as I'm sure that others will want to be able to use it in their communities as well. My guess is that there are going to be lots of questions for you about this handbook, how to use it, and what comes next. But I think that we can maybe leave that towards the end. We can have a much larger question and answer session, and I hope you'll be able to join us for that, John. But before we kind of move over to the next panel, I do want to thank John, first of all, for his presentation about the SDG Accountability Handbook, but I also want to see who all is here on this webinar today. So we actually have a poll for all of you, just to see kind of what your affiliation is in your organizational capacity. So are you a member of civil society, government, United Nations, the private sector, or other? Just be curious to hear from all of you. Feel free to just click the answer that works for you. All right, thank you so much. It looks like we have an overwhelming amount of civil society on this webinar, which is great. It looks like 92% are affiliated with civil society, so welcome everyone. We also do have a few government officials, we have a few private sector actors and others, so welcome to everyone, and we do think that this resource hopefully will be useful for kind of any sort of affiliation as well. Although with a real focus on helping civil society help their governments deliver on this ambitious agenda. So we're now going to move over to our expert panel discussion. I'm going to move right over to our presenters, Ollie Henman, Arlis Bellerini, and Claire Schouten, who will be presenting today. I'm going to ask each of them to briefly answer a few of the following questions during their presentation. Mainly, why is accountability for the SDGs important? How can national and local level civil society hold their governments accountable for the commitments to the 2030 Agenda? And what are some of the challenges and opportunities for SDG accountability? So to each of our panelists, if you could each briefly share your work around the SDGs and accountability, the importance of this handbook in your work, and how you plan to use this resource moving forward, that would be great. And then at the end of all of the panels, we'll open up for a larger question and answer session at the conclusion of these presentations. So Ollie, let's begin with you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much.
Hello.
It's great to be on the call. So as you may know, Action for Sustainable Development is a global network that brings together over 3,000 civil society organizations. And we are 80% based in the Global South, so it's very much a network of national coalitions and partners and members, particularly in African countries, Asian countries, Latin American countries, where there's been a strong build-up of national coalitions. And we, as Action for Sustainable Development, provide support and enable the voices of some of those networks to be heard through the VNRs and through a number of these processes that John has mentioned. So it's great to be part of this. I think it's very clear in my mind and in the way that we work as a network that the process of accountability on the SDGs does need to be driven by community-based organizations at the national and local level. That's the only way we're really going to see the change that the SDGs promised at the beginning. And unfortunately, I have to say that the first 4 years have not yet given us the breakthroughs that people were looking for. So when you mention the challenges and opportunities, then I think it's very clear that the challenges remain in terms of making that step change in how governments are actually defining their plans and involving civil society in ensuring those plans are actually implemented. So what can we do about it, and how do we work together with TAP? Well, we were very pleased to be part of feeding into the thinking on this handbook, and we think there's really valuable work that's been done here in terms of combining various different sectors and various different segments of information, whether that's to do with the human rights processes, the environmental processes, some of the more technical insider processes, but also the more public-facing awareness raising that can be done to shift the ability of civil society to engage in this agenda. So it's a very comprehensive handbook, and I also welcome and congratulate John and all of the team that have pulled it together. Specifically for us as Action for Sustainable Development, there are 2 or 3 things that we are most active on, and John has highlighted some of them already. As I said at the beginning, we're very much driven and led by national coalitions, and we have done some of the work with those national coalitions already over these first 3 or 4 years, supporting them to develop those spotlight reports or civil society reports that provide an independent analysis of what's actually happening on the ground. Because as we know, governments are submitting every year their VNRs, but they are very variable in what they cover, and they seem not to always look at the sort of whole of society approach that was promised at the beginning. So this is why we as Action for Sustainable Development have actively supported the building of national coalitions and the provision of these spotlight reports, and we're very keen to carry on working with all of you on that. I think it's mentioned in the handbook that you can find all of the civil society reports that have been collected over these first 3 or 4 years of the SDG process on our website. You can search them by country. You can also click on the year of each HLPF, and you can find the civil society reports there. We have updated that recently, and again, it's mentioned in the handbook to provide more of a scorecard approach, and this came from the national members themselves. So a number of countries where they move towards more of a scorecard where you can have a traffic light way of assessing progress on each of the goals. A good example of that is Sri Lanka, and we work closely with the Sri Lankan partner to develop that scorecard. So the scorecard is a kind of evolution of the civil society report that gives you a more visual way of understanding progress within a country. So again, that scorecard's available from our website. And I think what would be great as we move forward is that if each of those national coalitions that we are working together with is able to then share their learning, and we then collectively as a sector can strengthen each other's abilities. So it's not that one or other country has the answers. I think it really is a collaborative process where we're all learning from each other, and we're all hopefully then having a race to the top rather than a race to the bottom, where governments feel that they need to prove that they are actually doing more than their peers to demonstrate accountability. And that was my understanding of how the human rights agenda, the UPR, took on a stronger accountability demand, was because of that peer pressure between governments. And so I think ideally we collectively as civil society need to be generating that demand and highlighting where the challenges are, but also where the good examples are, so that governments will think, oh yeah, well, this is possible, we can go further next year, we can demonstrate our own accountability. Just finally, before I finish up, I would also mention, I think it is covered here as well, that the regional level and the global level are equally important. And I think it's really key for us all as civil society that we really highlight that this is an ongoing cycle that comes from the national level through to the regional level and to New York in July and back again, and that's an ever revolving cycle of accountability that doesn't just end when a country submits a VNR, but they then have to continue to engage with civil society afterwards when they go back to their own national level. So I think this is going to be an evolving picture, but the handbook really helps us to pin things down, and I look forward to continuing to work with all of you going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ali. Great to see a lot of the work really being done at the national level through coalition building and to help really drive this process. And I'm taking your phrase of cycle of accountability from local to national to regional to global and back through the cycle again to heart. And I hope that we can all in the coming months work together to make that happen. So Arliss, I'm curious to hear from you how World Vision is engaging with this resource and this process. Yeah, over to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, and hello everyone. Greetings from rainy New York, and particularly sitting down here just 2 blocks across the United Nations, where in a couple of months or so we will have one of the sessions of the HLPF, which will be closing the first cycle of review of this UN body. And in about 2 months after that, we will have the first SDG summit under the auspices of the General Assembly. So 2019, as you all know, a very challenging year because we have 2 meetings of the HLPF, which is going to be happening every 4 years. I'm speaking today both as World Vision, but also on behalf of Together 2030. Together 2030 is a global initiative with over 700 members organizations from across all regions and from over 75 countries. And again, most of our members are from the global south. We work and support our members on implementation and accountability on the 2030 agenda. Our main driver has been from policy to action, and we have a number of publications and resources about civil society engagement in national SDGs implementation. We have a handbook as well on working with parliamentarians. As you know, this is a very important stakeholder in the work of the implementation of the SDGs, particularly because it is through parliaments that we have the budget allocation for the implementation of the SDGs. We also are joined up with a number of civil society platforms on assessing the voluntary national review reports, and our good friend Oli made reference to that. Every year for the last 3 years, we have been convening to develop this independent assessment of how the content of the voluntary national reviews. When it comes to the 2030 agenda, we have, as you all know, on the one hand, a very transformative agenda with a set of ambitious goals. However, almost 4 years into SDGs implementation is confirming to us and reaffirming to us once again the complexities of implementation. It is also showing us that we are yet to fully unpack the interlinkages amongst and between the SDGs. And this is very critical for the implementation. If we want to do away with the traditional silo approach with which we have been doing development, we do have to address the interlinkages of the SDGs to enable the 3 dimensions of sustainable development to really come together and bring about the change and the transformation that this is seeking. All of this requires a much more robust system of tracking progress, like never before in international development. Subsequently, the accountability system and approach is likewise challenging. And we are so happy to see that this handbook is bringing together 17 specific approaches to both track progress and also hold government accountable. And I'm happy to share with all of you that one of such approaches is based on a methodology that World Vision has been using for several years at community level called Citizen Voice in Action, which includes active engagement from citizens, and particularly children and young people. These are some of the reasons why the SDG accountability handbook on accountability is so timely. We are really hopeful that it will provide civil society organizations at all levels, at national level, at regional and global level, with a unique set of tools to unleash their engagement and participation in the national processes of SDGs. Implementation at the same time, facilitating the tracking of progress, and to develop a full accountability agenda. John has shared with us the incredibly useful content of the handbook. And Together 2030, we are very much looking forward to engaging with our members, making the most out of this valuable resource. We are already talking and planning about holding particular webinars with our members, about possibly joining some of the workshops that are already been scheduled, but both TAP and A Action for Sustainable Development. And there are really a number of ways in which we can really coalesce to bring about a very useful engagement of the handbook into the national level implementation. I do not want to conclude these brief remarks without congratulating TAP Network, congratulating the steering committee, and particularly John for all the work and all the effort that has taken to bring together this incredibly useful handbook. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Arlis. Really appreciate the warm wishes, but also you sharing the perspective specifically on the importance of engaging global Southern organizations in this process, and then also emphasizing the word interlinkages and the interlinkages of this agenda. And, you know, a number of us do work on our little goals, but it's actually important to see that each of these goals actually enforce this entire ambitious agenda. So thank you so much for those remarks. Really appreciate it. All right, I will now turn it over to Claire. Claire, I'm curious to hear from you, you know, about kind of the international budget partnerships perspective on this, and, you know, how you're planning to use this resource in your work. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much. It's great to be here with you and connect with everyone. So the International Budget Partnership collaborates with organizations around the world towards more open, inclusive government budget policies and practices to ensure public resources are used effectively to fight poverty and promote equitable and sustainable development. And we learned early on that the first and enduring obstacles that citizens groups face is access to information and opportunities to participate in the budget process. The latest Open Budget Survey, the world's only independent comparable measure of budget transparency, participation, and oversight, shows that 77% of the 115 countries we surveyed with our civil society partners fail to provide sufficient information on how governments raise and spend public funds. and the progress achieved towards development goals. These problems are exacerbated by few opportunities for public participation in budgeting and the existence of weak and ineffective oversight institutions. We're in a context of shrinking civic space and rollback of freedoms. Budget groups around the world are playing an important role in SDG accountability. They are costing the SDGs and advancing alternative budgets in Central America and Ireland. They're engaging stakeholders on SDG budget analysis in Tanzania, producing shadow reports, as we talked about earlier, in Benin, Brazil, developing a citizens budget in Nepal to help the public understand how the government is addressing climate change. And they're informing and following up on audits of public concern. In more than 20 countries, civil society organizations are assessing and addressing the extent to which governments deviate from planned budgets. And this provides evidence for SDG 16 and offering solutions across the global goals. So this is all important for understanding whether governments are keeping their promises and delivering towards planned development goals. As the handbook highlights, civil society organizations are engaging throughout the budget process, from formulation to oversight, with state actors such as finance ministries, legislatures, and supreme audit institutions. They're collaborating with social movements and media, and connecting at the local, national, and global levels, as we've been highlighting, to hold governments to account. And they're using budget information to check alignment with national development plans and implementation. They're informing policy and practice and ensuring development dividends. IBP has collaborated with the TAP network over many years to ensure greater transparency and participation in the financing for development and the 2030 agendas. And we're delighted to have contributed to this handbook, and as it offers exciting opportunities to share findings and resources and experiences to support civil society and SDG accountability. We hope the tools and insights and recommendations from IBP and our partners in the Open Budget Survey, Learning Network, and country coalitions can be helpful as we strive for sound management of public resources and greater progress on the global goals. And we're really excited to continue this journey with you, and including how we can engage in different languages and incorporate these findings and engagement into VNRs and other processes that contribute to SDG accountability. So big congratulations to everyone involved in the TAP network who's contributed to this great resource, and thanks so much again for engaging us.
Thanks so much, Claire. And great and promising to see that civil society is also engaging in some of these budget processes. And exciting to see how kind of that work continues to evolve.
Thanks.
Yeah, so I'm now going to invite all of our panelists to come up and join us again for a robust question and answer session. Hello.
Unmuted.
Great, thanks so much for joining. And I think we'll start with just a general question. A few questions have come in, so we'll try to get to those as well. But some of them are really focused around, where do I start? So I'm a civil society organization. I want to get involved in this process. I maybe want to use this handbook, or I want to write a spotlight report. Where do I get started? So I might start with John, and then I'll invite others to kind of step in. But how do I get started in this process?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be somewhat brief on this, because I think the short answer to this question from my end at least is, I hope that the SDG Accountability Handbook would be a good resource to get started with. I mean, as I mentioned in the presentation, I do think that this is an opportunity to engage colleagues that haven't otherwise engaged in the SDGs to date. I think taking stock from our colleagues from our networks, and I'm sure it's similar for other networks as well, is that yes, we engage really deeply with colleagues that have already worked on the SDGs, but there's still a huge gap, especially engaging grassroots organizations going forward. There's the language barrier, there's capacity issues, there's a lot of challenges that we face practically taking things forward. And I think what we hope is that the SDG Accountability Handbook will provide an outlet for people to actually contribute towards, find out how they can engage. You know, like I said, I think some organizations may be more inclined or have the capacity to put together a spotlight report, for example. Some may not have that capacity or the knowledge or the data, but they can engage with the media, for example. So I do hope that this is kind of, I do hope that people see this not as, you know, kind of an all-inclusive list of how you should be engaging around accountability, but I hope it's kind of a menu for colleagues to choose from to see what approach is best for them and how they can engage. So again, it's another reason why it's hugely important for us to translate this and to take it with our national partners to local and grassroots organizations going forward. So that's my suggestion, is just to start with the handbook, I would hope.
Start with the handbook. That's great. Is there anyone else who'd like to chime in on this question?
Yes, perhaps I can just build on what John has said. I think one step could also be to reach out to national platforms. There are a number of civil society national platforms that have come together at national level. Some of them are existing platforms that have been reinforced or have adapted the SDGs advocacy and accountability work, and some of them are new. But to reach out to them and work in partnership with other civil society organizations and bring the handbook with you will also be a good start. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
And maybe I could also come in on this. I think we also have to be realistic, as John has said, that there will be some organizations out there that can't necessarily feel that they can go through all of the goals and produce a spotlight report or a shadow report. I mean, it is quite a technically demanding process. And I think one of the things that we could do more of, and we'll certainly be looking to do around September in particular, is more awareness raising to the wider public, to people who maybe still don't even know about the SDGs, who are not aware that their particular concern, whether it's youth engagement or indigenous rights or gender equality, is actually covered within the SDGs. So I think it's also about us highlighting that this is not a closed box. This is something that is available for people to adapt and to take forward depending on their own particular issue. So going to where people are, rather than necessarily expecting them to become experts on exactly which goal and which indicator they should be engaging with. So we need to improve that in terms of that awareness raising. And I think this handbook starts some of that path. And in September, that's one of the things we'll be pushing for when the heads of state are talking, that we really raise the public awareness and press awareness at that time. So let's see if we can build that momentum together.
Great, thanks. Claire, I think you're muted.
Oh, sorry. Sorry about that. I would just echo that as well. I think TAP is a fantastic network that gives access to grassroots organizations, international organizations, and because often it's about connecting those local problems, those local agendas with headquarters and policymakers in New York that many of us don't have access to. And I think that's where TAP has been fantastic. And again, this handbook really highlights those different channels that civil society can use and how we can build coalitions, how we can work across different sectors, how we can engage government and other state institutions, because that's ultimately what we have to do to advance the development agenda. So I think that's great added value of TAP.
That's great, thanks. We've had a few questions come in specifically around data and the fact that civil society is collecting lots of relevant data and how to figure out how to include that or supplement or complement a lot of the data that's being captured by government. As we know, collecting data on this agenda is not an easy task, and you know, there is a role and contribution that civil society can play in actually helping governments to collect this data, analyze this data. So whether you're talking about third-party data, non-official data, other forms of data, I'd be curious to hear if any of you have any thoughts on how civil society has used data to advance some of these goals, and or how you might see civil society contributing to SDG accountability through data.
Great, yeah, maybe I can start because as the focus of the TAP network, particularly since the adoption of the SDGs and SDG 16, that's one of our other thematic areas. I think this is hugely important, is the role of non-official or alternative data, data that comes from non-governmental and non-state actors. I think this is hugely important, not only because we shouldn't necessarily leave tracking of progress up to governments through their VNR process, for example. I think the VNR process, from what we've seen to date, is largely used as an opportunity to showcase what's going well in a particular country. And I think it's the role of what Spotlight reports can provide, is providing an alternative picture of progress. And I think it's hugely important for Spotlight reports to use some of the official statistics that governments collect, but to also provide their own analysis through their own data sources as well, or other alternative data sources. And just one quick plug is, we've done a lot of work on this around the SDG 16 targets, specifically through the SDG 16 data initiative. Again, you can find it sdg16.org. There's a lot of information about alternative data sources, how those can be used, specifically from an SDG 16 context, which I think is hugely important. But I do think that this, I hope, there's also a chapter on in the accountability handbook on using and improving data. So again, I do hope that colleagues will find this useful to help them understand where they can get started on that front as well.
The other thing that I wanted to pick up on was something that Airless mentioned, which is about, shrinking civic space, which comes up a lot, and unfortunately these days more and more. It's actually something that comes up actually for the Global Legal Empowerment Network as well, where attacks on justice defenders have actually been on the rise, horrifically so. So I'm curious to hear from you how you think, civil society engaging in this process in a collaborative way, through SDG accountability practices can actually help open up civic space.
Yeah, maybe I could come in on that one. I agree. This is an absolutely crucial aspect. I mean, we actually just hosted a session about this together with Civicus and CPDE just a couple of weeks ago in Belgrade during the International Civil Society Week, and we had a full day precisely discussing the intersection between the closing of civic space and the lack of progress on the SDGs. And I think you're absolutely right to highlight that, unfortunately, since 2015, the situation has become much harder in so many countries, including, Russia, but also Brazil now, India, Pakistan, so many countries where precisely the kind of stakeholders and civil society bodies that can provide expertise and insights into the real change that's needed to help those people who are furthest behind, whether that's indigenous people, young people, women's rights, they are the ones being targeted now directly by governments, environmental defenders, indigenous rights defenders. And so rather than just leaving no one behind, I think it was actually the UN Special Envoy now, Fabrizio Hofstadt, who came to speak in Belgrade. He was saying, well, not only are people being left behind, they're actually being pushed behind. And this is a serious risk that instead of improving and enabling more voices to be heard, we're seeing the opposite trend at the moment. And that does make it very, very hard for those ambitions and those transformational principles of the SDGs to be delivered. And so the message, I think, has to be clear that governments should identify and recognize that civil society is a legitimate partner in this process, and that those kinds of attacks and restrictions must stop. And we welcome the UN's support in ensuring that the principles that are there in the SDGs and in the human rights conventions and so on are properly implemented.
Great, thanks. I agree. Anyone else want to come in on this topic?
Yeah, I think that on the other hand, the 2030 agenda offers many opportunities. It's very clear, laid out in the 2030 agenda, both on the values and the principles about stakeholders or civil society engagement. And while it is there is a regression on the space, we must hold governments accountable again on what they have committed to in 2015 regarding the 2030 agenda. And those are the opportunities that we need to reach out to, and in the midst of the challenges that Oli has outlined.
Yeah, and if I could just very quickly too, I mean, when we put together the accountability handbook, it focuses on vertical accountability, so the relationship between a state and its people, and the obligations through the SDGs that states have in regards to their citizens. But I think there's also an important role to play for horizontal accountability here as well. I think it's incumbent upon governments that are champions of civic space and democratic freedoms. Quite honestly, it's incumbent on them to also push those governments to be more inclusive and open, and to hold them accountable. So I think there's a role to play, yes, on citizens holding governments accountable in their own countries, but I think the horizontal as well.
Thanks, Don. I appreciate that. Claire, you are able to speak now if you would like to.
Unmuted. Great. Sorry about that. I think there's an echo on my side, so sorry about that. No, I think this reinforces the importance of coalitions and connecting with allies across different sectors, across different levels, and working with accountability institutions like human rights commissions and anti-corruption bodies and oversight bodies that can help our case as well. And just on the use of data, again, bringing together our civil society allies, social movements, grassroots movements, working together to call for the information that we need in order to track progress, in order to hold governments accountable. So we've certainly found that challenge as we conduct the open budget survey. We just don't have the basic documents and budget information and policy information that we need to be able to hold governments accountable. So I think there's a real opportunity there to mobilize together and connect with actors facing similar problems to ensure our voices are heard.
Yeah, that's great. I agree. Thanks. And I appreciate also the framing around, this as an opportunity. And so, hopefully this handbook will be useful in some way in kind of helping to create a positive and open and collaborative environment for civil society to participate with their governments on delivering on this agenda moving forward. So we do have a few hands that have been raised, so hopefully the technology will cooperate with us. But I do want to invite, folks, if they would like to raise a hand and ask a question to a specific panelist or a broader question at large, we'll try to make that work for you. So I see someone named Donatus has raised their hand. So Donatus, do you have a question for our panel? So I think that the question was also written in. So really it's a question around, we're already in the year 2019. 2030 is coming up quite quickly. How do we kind of accelerate progress on this agenda, knowing that we're already behind in some ways towards this?
Maybe I'll take this one first. I think that's a very deep question to answer in the limited time that we have left. I think there's a lot of things. I think we've talked about a few ways that we can do that. I think Claire mentioned the role of coalition building. I do think that there's a role for coalition building amongst civil society, but I really do think that especially because governments are the duty bearers when it comes to the SDGs, I do think that I think it is worthwhile to have colleagues establish groups of champions around particular SDGs and around particular issues like leaving no one behind, for example, or shrinking civic space. I think there is a huge role to be played by governments to become champions. And so in addition to holding governments accountable through all of these things that we outlined in the Accountability Handbook, I think what isn't said in that Accountability Handbook and about accelerating progress is about encouraging your government to really take ownership of the SDGs. I think that's part of the challenge here, is that governments have a lot of commitments to a lot of different international treaties or other obligations. They have obligations through their constitutions. I think it's important for us to identify where the SDGs link up with those other commitments that, particularly because the SDGs are voluntary, it's much easier for governments to kind of dismiss them and turn them away and say, we have other priorities. But I think linking the SDGs with constitutional commitments, for example, and saying, you are constitutionally supposed to deliver this to your citizens, also allows us to hold governments accountable a lot easier. So one of the chapters in the SDG Accountability Handbook is about strategic litigation, for example. It's about suing your government to hold them accountable if they aren't living up to some of their expectations or some of their commitments through the constitutional law as well. So I think making those linkages between the SDGs and other commitments that they've made as well is important. But I think pushing them to be champions of the SDGs more broadly, but around specific issues that they care about. We know that governments care about specific issues. Getting them to become champions and building kind of with coalitions of the willing with other member states, I think is also important. I think that's a short answer to a very complex question.
Thanks, John.
Yeah, indeed, a very complex question. I would add, we need to work also on the global level. The high-level political forum is the UN body that has been mandated to track progress. And this is an architecture that has been set up to also hold governments accountable. And it has concluded, this year is going to be concluding its first cycle of review. And the high-level political forum is going to be reviewed in its way of working, its content of work, and so on. So this is a great opportunity for this forum to actually live up to its full mandate and really track progress on SDG implementation as part of that accountability agenda.
Great, agreed. Thanks, Arla.
Perhaps just to add how we can support the peer learning across governments, across civil society, to ensure that we're sharing those lessons. And that's something that we found from analyzing the shortfalls of the MDGs and just understanding what sort of accountability ecosystems can we build across institutions, formal and informal institutions, to drive the right kind of policies and processes that are needed for accountability, that are needed for results, and how can we facilitate that learning and learn those lessons to again accelerate progress for the SDGs. So again, I think those are helpful insights as well, building on what our colleagues have said.
Great, thanks so much. I wish we had time for even more questions. There have actually been a number of fantastic questions and comments that have come through. But I guess I just want to thank each of our panelists for taking the time to share your experiences and perspectives and ideas on how to use this handbook moving forward. So thanks so much, everyone, for joining. And I think the other piece of this is that this is just the start. This is now, this resource has been launched. It's available. It can be used in many different contexts and ways, and we look forward to continuing the conversation with you in the coming days, weeks, months, and years on how to really make sure that civil society is helping to hold governments accountable for this agenda, and I might add vice versa. So I think that there are a few things that, are kind of to continue the discussion. So I think that, again, the handbook does really aim to serve as a practical resource for civil society, that will be constantly updated and, really reflect the live and living experiences of civil society. And then also just to ensure the resource's ongoing relevance and usefulness, the TAP network invites you and others who are working on this agenda to engage with the handbook and contribute the case study or submit a spotlight report, suggest additional guidance, or really to host a national workshop or accountability training, to really help promote this peer learning and mutual accountability for this agenda. And there are a lot more opportunities that you can find by actually going on to the website for the SDG Accountability Handbook and actually seeing about ways that you can engage moving forward. So with that, I just want to thank everyone again for their time and attention and thoughtful questions. I think that we are at the start of a really exciting time. This year is already turning out to be a really exciting year for SDG accountability and progress. And I really look forward to seeing how some of these pieces evolve in the coming months, whether at national workshops or at regional convenings or at global meetings like the High-Level Political Forum or the UN General Assembly. Please stay tuned. We will follow up with an email recording of this webinar itself, so share with others. And there will be continuing opportunities to continue the discussion even after this webinar is finished. So thank you so much and have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.